Woohoo! Thank you, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon breakout session, Improving Quality of Life with PPA. PPA, of course, stands for primary progressive aphasia, an FTD disorder defined by its language-related symptoms. People with PPA may struggle to say what they want to say or to understand what others are talking about. This can be incredibly frustrating condition for persons diagnosed and their loved ones, as many of you here likely know firsthand. But researchers at the University of Chicago are testing an intervention that could facilitate improved communication and therefore a higher quality of life in PPA, known as Communication Bridge. It uses technology such as telehealth and wearable sensors to help families overcome language difficulties. Dr. Emily Rogalski leads the Communication Bridge Research Program. She is the Rosalind Franklin Professor of Neurology at the University of Chicago and also serves as director of the university's Healthy Aging and Alzheimer's Research Center. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rogalski to the stage.
Thank you so much. I want to welcome those that are in the room, but also welcome those that are online attending virtually. I'm so glad to be here today and have the opportunity to tell you a little bit about Communication Bridge. So to start, yes, we're coming to you. The program originates at the University of Chicago. You may have heard of it before. I was previously at Northwestern, and a couple years ago had the opportunity to start a new research center at the University of Chicago called the Healthy Aging and Alzheimer's Research Care Center. And so now Communication Bridge is there as well. When we think about PPA and FTD disorders, we've heard a lot about trying to support not only from the cognitive profile and the neurobiology disease, but also personal identity, family and life dynamics. And these are the approaches that I take in my lab, both understanding the neurobiology of disease, but then also creating interventions that help individuals based on the things that are most important to them. So it may not matter if you can't remember the word that goes with the picture on the Boston naming test. That might not be the most important thing to you, whether you know the word rhinoceros or another animal that's pictured. It may be more important that you can go to the grocery store and pick out the ingredients for your favorite recipe. This is where we're grounded in Communication Bridge and thinking about interventions in that space. So before I talk to you about that, I know we've had a lot of education, and I wanted to give a little bit of background about PPA in specific. So we think of it as this clinical syndrome where there's loss of language that impacts communication with others. But there's relative sparing, at least early on, of our other cognitive abilities. And this happens because the language network of the brain, which is typically located on the left side of our brain, is damaged. And that damage occurs progressively. And it's caused by not PPA disease. If things were simple, there would be a PPA disease that caused PPA. But as we've heard over and over the last 2 days, things are much more complex. And so instead, we have 3 families of disease that can cause primary progressive aphasia. One of those families is Alzheimer's disease. The plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease can cause the clinical symptoms of primary progressive aphasia. Another family is the frontotemporal lobar degeneration with the tau form. And then the third family is TDP-43. And then it gets much more complex than that. So we're gonna stop there for complexities, and I'm gonna walk it back and say, gosh, what do these 3 things have in common? And before we do that, I want to say we're getting better at diagnosing and identifying these different families of disease during life. It wasn't so long ago that they could only be identified after someone donated their brain and we looked under the microscope. We are now developing both imaging biomarkers and blood biomarkers that can be helpful in diagnosing these diseases. We're a little bit further along in Alzheimer's disease neuropathology than we are in the others, but they are coming. So what do they have in common? And I like to use this analogy and hope that it's not too simplistic, but I think of it as that their normal proteins that are in our body have a way of folding that's really beautiful, and you can think of it like origami. And what happens in neurodegenerative disease is that these proteins become abnormal and they misfold, and you can kind of think of them like a clump of paper. And when they clump up like this picture here, they also become sticky. And so they attract more and more of these clumps, and that's what we call aggregation. And then this aggregation causes grief in the brain and causes neurodegeneration or disruption to brain cells and causes them to die. And so all of the families of disease have those same things in common. And so as we think about interventions in care, we've focused a lot on the medical or pharmacologic options for care. And we focus less on the non-pharmacological options. And that's what we'll talk about a bit today. Before we get there, I want to think about our care team. And our care team doesn't just include these individuals, which sometimes can still be hard to find. So speech-language pathologists, neuropsychologists, neurologists, and social workers. But here's an example of all of the people that are involved in care of FTD. And you'll see very quickly that that includes both people who can provide pharmacological options, non-pharmacological options, or non-drug options, but also supportive care and services. So it's a large umbrella of support. We don't want these clinicians to work in isolation, but to work connectedly at a team. And the AFTD does a wonderful job of trying to promote that connection. I want to walk through some historic and sometimes current barriers to care. These have been mentioned throughout the past 2 days, but I think they bear mentioning again, just in case you didn't hear the earlier talks. The diagnostic challenges are real. It can be difficult to find someone locally, and this creates disproportional access to care. It's for this reason that we don't even know that we have an accurate number of the people who are living with FTD disorders. Because time passes, there also can be increase in severity. It's harder to recognize because of the younger age of onset, and this creates an evidence-based treatment gap. And I want to share a brief video, and I know we've heard so many powerful stories, but I think it's helpful to hear yet one more of these diagnostic challenges.
We were working on conference calls, and as more and more of the people were on the calls, I was getting lost, and it wasn't good.
He was realizing it was hard for him to communicate at work, and he had been leading conference calls, and those were getting more and more challenging. And I could tell just something was wrong as it was progressing and getting worse. And so we knew we had to figure it out. So we just searched, went to lots of doctors until we got an answer. We went to 3 different states, 7 different doctors.
3 different states, 7 different doctors, and we've heard that story throughout the last 2 days. In some ways, things have been starting to improve and get better, but we still have more work to do. When we think about PPA and developing both pharmacological and non-pharmacological interventions, the way that we think about it is remembering that it's not just about the individual who's living with a diagnosis, but it's also about their family members. It's about their family relationships that have changed and modified over time, and how we're going to move forward. And so we integrate that into our care models. So I've listed some barriers and challenges, but there are also solutions, and some of those you've seen in action through the talks today. Increased awareness, education, and advocacy. Telemedicine. Telemedicine is a really powerful way to connect people that allows them to stay in their own homes and not have to travel across multiple states. Multi-component care, thinking not just about that diagnostic, the individual who's living with a diagnosis, but also other professionals who can support care. And then finally, clinically meaningful outcomes. So it's not just getting better on our standardized tests, but how is it impacting your everyday life? So we've heard a lot about pharmacological trials, and I'm going to kind of walk through this really quickly. We've seen different slides showing these 4 phases, sometimes with a preclinical part at the beginning, and these are really important. And I put this up here because there's a little bit of a different model when we think about non-pharmacological care and the different phases. Pharmacological treatments, we know that there's not a definitive option to halt or reverse FTD disorders, but that this is an active area of research and there are clinical trials now. And this is a space that there weren't necessarily clinical trials just a few short years ago. I'm not going to spend a lot of time walking through these today because you've heard about them in the other sessions, but this is not only hope, but real progress. As we think about interventions, care, and support in the non-pharmacological space, there are also a lot of options that have been trialed. Art therapy, music therapy, TDCS or TMS, other multidisciplinary interventions. Support groups are a form of intervention that have been trialed, and speech-language therapy. I've had the great opportunity to meet and lead different support groups for individuals with a diagnosis of PPA and their caregivers, and brought individuals together for one of the first support groups for diagnosed individuals, which might sound a little odd at first, because you say, well, why would you bring individuals living with PPA together to talk if that's the things that's most difficult for them? But it actually was tremendously powerful, a powerful way for them to bring together and meet each other, share their experiences. And so we painted together, we did art therapy, we did other forms of horticultural therapy together, and we were able to also have these groups online. We had a dyadic support group where both individuals with a diagnosis and their care partners participated. Together, it brought us the opportunity to learn from each other. Some of the themes that came from those studies were coping with limitations of language decline and daily life. They brought a sense of belonging, an opportunity to confront stigma, and also, and importantly, a way to express resilience. Speech-language therapy. That's where we're going to focus the rest of our time today. And the good news is interest and studies related to speech-language therapy have really been increasing. So this graph here shows over time across the bottom, and then the y-axis, or what goes up and down, is showing us the number of publications. And so that's one way to quantify interest in speech-language therapy and success in this space. So when we think about intervention, I said trials in non-pharmacological space are a little different. We don't have the same 4 phases. It was recognized by Dr. Onken that those 4 phases didn't quite fit, and we needed a little bit of a different model. And so this might look messy up here, but it's actually really helpful for thinking about the different stages of intervention that are helpful for designing a trial, not only designing it, but evaluating its usefulness. And so how do we put it into a space that shows us that these trials can be done as rigorously as pharmacological trials? So there's a stage 0 that really focuses on basic research. That's the development and understanding mechanisms of behavior. And then it moves on to a stage 1, where we think a little bit more about that intervention development. We might do some pilot testing. And then we want to test that intervention under ideal conditions, so inside of a research setting. So it's delivered by research staff, but it can still be a randomized controlled trial. So it can still be done with that same rigor that pharmacological trials. And one of the reasons that this model was developed is that there was recognition that there were trials that were happening, but they never made it out of the lab. They might have shown success, but they didn't move on to these next stages, which are so important. Thinking about delivery by community providers, so it makes it outside of the research lab. And then in real world settings. And finally, to promote adoption widespread. So what kind of studies have been done in primary progressive aphasia? I showed you that increases happen. There's more studies happening. And the good news is that the success of those early studies has been really encouraging. They found positive results. But most of those interventions focused on naming, and that makes sense because thinking of words or naming different objects is a common feature of primary progressive aphasia. And so this was good evidence to tell us that speech therapy could be helpful. But most of those studies were single case studies and small designs or small case cohort designs, and so not quite enough to give that level of evidence of a randomized control trial. So if we think about it in this NIH stage model, they were really at this phase, stage 0 or stage 1. This presented an opportunity for us to think about how do we do a randomized controlled trial? And the story really begins with observational study research that I was doing, where we were flying participants in from all over the country, and then they were going back home. And they said, hey, we learned a lot when we came and participated in your research study, but now we're back home and we can't find care. We can't find connection. And if you look back to those early speech therapy trials, part of the reason that there was only 1 or 2 or 5 people enrolled was because that's all that lived in that area or region. And when you do an intervention study, it's different from observational because you need people to come in week after week after week. So you can't fly people back and forth if they don't live close. So we wanted to bridge the gap by taking advantage of the fact, and now this is about 10 years ago, that at the time people were starting to use Skype and FaceTime as a way to connect with their families. And I thought, hey, could we use this opportunity to also connect expert clinicians with an individual with a diagnosis? We had no idea if it would work. It was very risky, but we forged forward, and with the support of philanthropy and also the AFTD and a pilot grant at the time, I think one of their first pilot grants that was not focused on basic research, we had the opportunity to try. And so our goal with Communication Bridge is to maximize communication and quality of life for persons with PPA and their communication partners. And so we put that person living with PPA at the center, but we don't just think about the language impairment. We think about the other aspects of life that are impacted. We want to improve access to care through telemedicine. That doesn't mean that's the only way it can be delivered, but it helps to bridge that gap that if you don't have something locally, you can still connect to care. And then finally, we built a custom web application. And the purpose of the web application is to make sure that there's continuity of care when you're not meeting with your expert clinician. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of working with a physical therapist who is fantastic, and you go in there and you may have twisted your ankle, and it seems so easy when you're in there with your physical therapist and they tell you how to do the exercises, and then you come home and you try to do them at home and you have a bad Xerox copy of the exercises and you can no longer remember exactly how to do them. So we created this web application to reinforce strategies, to provide an opportunity for home practice, and to provide a hub for the research intervention. And I'll show you a little bit more of the examples of it in a while. When we think about technology, I've talked about a lot of technology. I've talked about video chat, and I've talked about a custom web application. We recognize that tailoring technology is important and that different aspects of technology might not be right for everyone. And so I'm going to show you a video that hopefully you find some laughter and joy about. And it's just hopefully to emphasize that we understand that there's different ways to meet people and to use technology.
Sag mal, Papa, habe ich dich noch gar nicht gefragt. Wie kommst du eigentlich mit dem neuen iPad zurecht, was wir dir zum Geburtstag geschenkt haben?
Gut.
Mit den ganzen Apps kommst du klar?
Was denn für Apps? Geh mal bitte einen Schritt zur Seite.
So I should have warned you. It's not in English. It's okay. And it might have been hard to see, but the gentleman in the back has an iPad, and he has found an excellent use for that technology. It just happens to be not the same use that his daughter or whomever it is who purchased that technology for him had intended. So we get it. Technology may not be a one-size-fits-all thing for everyone, but there's still ways to utilize technology that might be helpful. And sometimes that means our care partners are helping a little bit more with the technology. And so as we think about technology, one way is to use video chat to connect to clinicians. Another way is to support through a web application, but also technology can be supportive in our everyday lives. If you love to read, but it might be a little bit difficult now, perhaps an audiobook might be helpful as you read along. Or maybe you don't read the book at all, but just listen. You might also use technology to create communication aids. So this is an example of a sequencing aid to help someone make their favorite salad recipe. So there's different ways in which we can employ and add technology, and we can implement it in a way that is helpful. So I want to walk through kind of our initial prototype of the Communication Bridge web application that gave people the opportunity to log in with their email address and password, and then they're greeted by a motivating pop-up that tells them this is the number of times that you've logged in, because you should get credit for logging into your web application. We are proud of you, and we think that that's important. And then you're greeted by a home page. And on this home page, you have the opportunity to click on exercises. Some of those exercises include pictures, the opportunity to get hints related to those pictures. The hints can be written, they can be auditory, and the opportunity to provide an answer to that picture by either recording it, typing it, and you can hear back your answer. So this gives people the opportunity to practice in a way where they can even get the answer before sharing it. Because for some individuals, it might be helpful just to read the word that's on the page. So this supportive, errorless learning technique can be quite helpful. Because it's all done on technology, from a researcher standpoint, we can also quantify how fast and how well individuals may be doing over time. Oh, you also get credit for every time that you do these exercises, so we count that too. But we can look at how accuracy improves. We can look at how hints are needed over time, and how fast one's response gets. So this is really helpful for us from a research standpoint. We have another exercise that's focused on pronunciation, recognizing that words with multiple syllables or multisyllabic words can be difficult for individuals with a diagnosis of PPA. We can help improve the ability to say those words through specialized practice that you learned about through the intervention, but then you can also practice at home. There's also an exercise that we talk about called script practice. And so these are longer phrases. So it could be about ordering your favorite meal at the drive-thru, or describing the condition of primary progressive aphasia. We have an exercise where you can match a word to a picture so that you get a feedback right away about the accuracy of that. So it helps to strengthen those relationships between words and objects, another challenge that individuals with primary progressive aphasia can have. In addition to having these home exercises, we also have resources that can be available to individuals. These are downloadable and added by the clinicians. There's a calendar feature to make it easy for individuals to log into their sessions and to see upcoming sessions. So they simply click on that session and their video chat will appear and log them in. And then finally, there are videos to reinforce. And so the strategies that they're learning, and this gets back to the idea of the physical therapist analogy. So there's an opportunity to not just have a Xerox copy, but to watch videos that describe the strategies they learned in session. They can then share them with friends and family. They can watch them with their communication partner. And then finally, no good app is complete without having a you get credit screen, just like we have for our Fitbits or Apple Watches, talking about how many exercises you've done, when you've logged into the web application, et cetera. So we started this as a pilot study, and that was just to figure out, would people log on? Would they join? And we see that that was feasible. We enrolled 57 individuals. Those 57 individuals came not only from the United States, but also from Canada, Spain, and Singapore. So we were able to reach people no matter where they lived. We just had to figure out time zones, especially when it came to Singapore, so that it wasn't in the middle of the night for one person versus another. And what we found was that individuals connected and they really appreciated it. They found that it was just like having the therapist in the room, says one participant. We found that the individuals, more than 90% of them reported that the intervention met or exceeded expectations. And we found that there was gains following the 2-month intervention, and that those gains were largely maintained at 6 months. So for the period when the intervention was not happening, and individuals only had access to their web application. So this gave us really the important ammunition to go to NIH and apply for funding for a proper randomized controlled trial. The study also importantly told us about who benefited the most, and we found that people with the most engaged communication partners showed the strongest benefit. We also found that we could deliver cognitive tests remotely, and that could be done reliably. Mind you, this was all before the pandemic. This was before we all knew how to use Zoom. And so these are all important advancements, but I also wanted to share a couple meaningful examples of change. And so this is an individual who participated in one of our initial trials. And he lived on a farm. And part of his routine was to give commands to his dog Cookie to herd the sheep. This was becoming challenging for him, so much so that he was thinking about giving up the sheep and abandoning this activity. Through the intervention, he was able to relearn these commands and actively re-engage in this activity. Another individual really loved to play golf and had abandoned her golf game because she couldn't talk about it with her friends. So if you see shrinking social circles in this circumstance, because individuals are no longer doing things that they love, but they're also not communicating with their friends. And so she developed a series of cards where she focused on her golf swings, and this gave her the encouragement and the excitement to then go back out and resume her golf game. Other couple examples of meaningful change. You saw this picture before, but here's a sequencing aid for someone who is able to create their salad at home again. Individuals who love to garden could come up with the name of the flowers, their favorite flowers in their garden more easily. People who are able to now order their favorite drive-through menu order. And then we also work with individuals on describing their condition. We want to help them be able to describe it in their own words, but also to carry cards in their back pocket. So when those words aren't accessible, they can still have a backup plan in place. So here's one of those personalized cards. And then I'll show you another example here. I'm losing my words. It's a relatively rare neurologic condition called PPA, primary progressive aphasia. My speech has slowed down. I have to plan out each word, one syllable at a time. PPA only affects my speech, nothing else. It does not affect my mind and intellect. My good friends say that an attorney without words is a real blessing. So bear with me. So if you might have guessed, this gentleman was an attorney, and he found good humor in the way that he personalized his card to share his story of his diagnosis. So this led to Communication Bridge 2, the first randomized control trial for individuals with primary progressive aphasia. Participants were with us for over 12 months, or for about 12 months. They completed 2 blocks of intervention that are marked by those little lines on the screen, and then we had evaluation points that are marked by those larger turquoise blocks here on the screen. And the important part is that in both arms of the intervention, participants received active intervention. So it wasn't a waitlist trial. It wasn't a trial where there was no intervention in one arm and yes in another. And the goal was to determine which approach is most efficacious and which strategies are most helpful. We designed it so that there was equivalent dosing by arm. We also assessed fidelity from 3 different perspectives: documentation, procedural, and theoretical. This is probably only exciting to the scientists in the room. And we also put in place important blinding so that we tried to avoid biases. So both participants and people who assessed outcomes in the trial did not know which arm of the trial the individuals were in. And then importantly, when we think about outcome measures, we picked outcome measures that were important to the family. So they weren't just about whether individuals could come up with a word or not, but how it changed their life participation. So this design met the rigor required for pharmacological trials and included clinically meaningful outcomes, which is also an important element in FDA approval. And although we don't need that for a non-pharm trial, we still wanted it there nonetheless. When we think about the intervention development, we thought about independence. What can the individual still do or potentially do independently with or without supports? Personal identity, what provides purpose and motivation for that individual and their family? Knowledge and insight, what level of knowledge and insight is there? Viewpoints, consideration from multiple perspectives, both the individual as well as their friends and family and clinicians. Expectations, what were individuals and their families expecting, and how do we set those expectations appropriately? And how do we think about the environment in which they live that is either promoting communication and participation or making it more difficult? If you go to eat out at a restaurant, sitting in the middle of the room where it's very noisy can be very distracting and make it feel quite overwhelming. Simply asking for a table in a quieter part of the restaurant can really make the difference of whether you feel comfortable going out to eat or picking a restaurant that might be quieter altogether. So we ran this trial and successfully enrolled 95 individuals across 4 countries, multiple US states, including as far away as New Zealand and as close as Chicago where we live. This took a lot of help. I am so thankful for the clinicians who referred participants. I'm so thankful for the families who found us and stayed with us for this full year. We enrolled individuals relatively equal across gender. we did not do such a great job in diversity, and this is a challenge across the field in a space where we can grow and do better. If you're familiar with the 3 subtypes of PPA, we were able to invite individuals irrespective of the language profile that they had, and so all individuals were, across those profiles were included. And we had communication partners that were enrolled. Most of those were spouses, but we also had relatives and friends that had the opportunity to serve as the communication partner. Age at baseline was really similar to what we see in most studies where individuals are in their mid-60s with a range from 50s to 80s. When we look at outcome measures, these are kind of the technical details of what we did in the trial. The importance is that we were able to look at the success after each block of the intervention, as well as maintenance over time. Because there have not been any randomized control trials to date, it's important to understand what dose is most important and how long it lasts. So I want to walk through some of the outcome measures that we used. One of them is called the Communicative Participation Item Bank, or CPIB. And what this measure does is it asks about participation in communication participation in different settings. So for example, does your condition interfere with talking with people you know? And so individuals rate on this 10-point scale at the beginning and across different time points in the intervention. And so when we look at the outcomes, we saw that there was a significant increase in communication participation even after the first block of intervention in the experimental group, and that they were able to show that increase again after the second block of intervention, and it was maintained over time. This increase in the second block was a little bit less, but the second block also had a shorter number of sessions. And so this gives us evidence that maybe we needed a longer block of intervention in that second block. Another approach that we used is something called goal attainment scaling. And so this gives us the opportunity to set goals with the dyad. So both the individual and their communication partner set communication participation goals to meet in the intervention, and then we evaluated those over time. So each person with PPA developed 3 goals. Goals were leveled at a starting point of 0, and then we could see whether a person was moving closer to reaching their goal or moving away from their goal at each evaluation point. When we look at the outcomes, we see that the majority of individuals were able to move towards their goals, and we showed superiority in the experimental arm. So in other words, the intervention worked. We showed that individuals were not only able to do this at the first block of intervention, but they were able to maintain this over time. The control group also showed gains towards their goals. This is important because it teaches us about different ways that we can deliver intervention and that they can have good benefit. Not only did we have these outcomes that were related to communication participation, but we also wanted to look at fluency in speech. And we showed that individuals who practiced scripts over time also showed gains, and those gains were maintained over time. We also looked at word performance. Could you find and get those words more easily? So individuals had words that they were trained on, both in the sessions and in their home exercise. And we showed that after the first intervention block, there were significant increases, and those were maintained over time. This is particularly notable because if you look at observational studies over that 1-year period, you would expect at least a 14% decline in naming ability over that same period of time. So the fact that you can get increase with maintenance over a 12-month period is pretty remarkable. So we also got positive feedback. It's important that we learn about what goes well and what doesn't go well, and a summary of that feedback here, but the feedback was really even more robust than this. So 88% found that communicating in daily activities was easier, 73% reported emotional well-being was better, 95% thought that speech therapy was helpful, and 88% of the individuals said that it met or exceeded expectations. So to summarize the results, this is the first behavioral RCT for individuals with PPA. We enrolled individuals globally. We showed high feasibility and low dropout. In most pharmacological trials, the dropout rates can exceed 30 to 40%. So having 6% dropout was pretty remarkable. We had high fidelity of the intervention and showed superiority of our experimental arm. There was no safety concerns with the intervention, and we showed changes in functionally and clinically meaningful outcomes. And I mentioned this before, we showed gains in both the control arm and the experimental arm. And so this is really important for promoting speech therapy and important to any clinicians in the room thinking about referring to speech language pathologists. They can be helpful. I've talked a lot, and so I want you to hear instead, not from me, but from a person who was a part of the intervention. You'll get to see their naming before and after, and then a quick anecdote of participation in daily life.
Right here, this is, I say it, it's here, but I can't say it. It is Dom's, or Dom, I say Dom. Dominize, you know. Oh, Ted Lowe's. Dry cleaners, Dono, Ted Lasso.
Like I said, yesterday we were at this winery, and I was kind of, after we left, I was telling Julie the same thing, that I was kind of impressed with myself yesterday, because several times I went up to just jokingly say something to somebody else in a different.
He was interacting with people he didn't know.
But I'm not going up to him and getting a big conversation with him, but I may go up and say something funny to him, you know.
So you're re-engaging in life. You're going out into a winery and you're talking with others. It has to feel good. So we're not done. We found this intervention. We showed that it works, but it's right now in the research laboratory. We have to get it out. So we're on this path, we're on this mission for implementation, and part of the steps of getting there is running another randomized controlled trial, but in parallel, also looking for opportunities, now that we know that we have a successful trial, to move towards implementation. So we want to partner with the clinicians, we want to partner with others to work towards that implementation. If you're interested in participating in the Communication Bridge 3 trial, there will be information at the end here, and we're also happy to talk to you at the end to provide information. So this gives us an opportunity to incorporate the feedback from our last trial. We are planning for this trial, including things that are really important, such as cost analysis and thinking about objective measures of outcomes. So we ask individuals to wear wearable sensors so that we can actually track how well individuals are leaving their home, how well they're communicating with others. And we can do this through supportive technology such as wearable sensors. And we are working with many, many stakeholders. We have an implementation advisory board, and we also have a family advisory board. We're always looking for more members. So if participation in the trial isn't a good fit, we still could use your feedback and would be happy to partner with you in whatever way looks right for you. So I'll end with, I want to show you an enhanced version of our web application that was supported by the feedback of participants that were a part of the last 2 trials. And we moved the web application to an iPad so that it would be easier to practice than on a computer where it was before.
Welcome to the Communication Bridge app. Let's log in. EMAs help us keep track of a participant's mood and satisfaction in real time. Participants will use several at-home exercises to train the skills they are working on during sessions. The picture card exercise provides both written and audio cues.
A chart that shows the days of the year. Cow.
The user can then practice retrieving the word and saying it aloud. Calendar. They can also practice writing using their Apple Pencil.
Calendar.
In the word-to-picture matching exercise, the participant sees a written word. Then, they choose the corresponding picture from 4 choices. Let's hear from one of our avatars about the scripts exercise.
Hello, welcome to Communication Bridge. The scripts exercise will help you practice sentences and prepare for conversations.
Under the Calendar tab, users can view their upcoming sessions and log on to calls directly from the app. Here, participants can view their achievements, such as how many times they visit the app and how many activities they complete. To reach out to a study team member or submit documents, simply go to the Contact tab.
So thank you so much for your time, attention, participation. We're beyond hope. We have an evidence-based intervention now. We have something that has proof that it works. We're moving towards implementation, and I think it's a really exciting place to be. If you're interested in learning more, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Rogalski. We are going to take our final break of the day, but it's a short one, so please come right on back because we have a wonderful closing plan for all of you. So sit tight for the next 15 minutes, and thank you.